Great Expectations, Chapter 5. The apparition of a file of soldiers ringing down the butt ends of their loaded muskets on our doorstep, causing the dinner party to rise from the table in confusion, and caused Mrs. Joe, re-entering the kitchen empty-handed, to stop short and stare in her wondering lament of, "Gracious goodness, gracious me, what's gone with the pie?" Mrs. Joe stood staring. It was the sergeant who had spoken to me, and he was now looking around at the company, with his handcuffs invitingly extended towards them in his right hand, and his left on my shoulder. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," said the sergeant. "I am on a chase in the name of the king, and I want the blacksmith." "You see, blacksmith," said the sergeant, who had by this time picked out Joe, "we have had an accident with these, and I find the lock of one of them goes wrong. As they are wanted for immediate service, will you throw your eye over them?" Joe threw his eye over them and pronounced that the job would necessitate the lighting of his forge fire and would take nearer 2 hours than 1. "Will it? Then you will set about it at once, blacksmith," said the offhand sergeant. "As it's on His Majesty's service?" I was in an agony of apprehension, but beginning to perceive that the handcuffs were not for me, and that the military had so far got the better of the pie as to put it in the background, I collected a little more of my scattered wits. "How far might you call yourselves from the marshes hereabouts? Not above a mile, I reckon." "Just a mile," said Mrs. Joe. "That'll do. We begin to close in upon 'em about dusk." "Convicts, sergeant?" asked Mr. Wopsle. "Aye," returned the sergeant. "2. They're pretty well known to be out on the marshes still, and they won't try to get clear of 'em before dusk. Anybody here seen anything of such game?" Everybody, myself excepted, said no, with confidence. Nobody thought of me. At last Joe's job was done, and the ringing and roaring stopped. As Joe got on his coat, he mustered courage to propose that some of us should go down with the soldiers and see what came of the hunt. Mr. Wopsle said he would go if Joe would. Joe said he was agreeable and would take me if Mrs. Joe approved. She merely stipulated, "If you bring the boy back with his head blown to bits by a musket, don't look to me to put it together again." Mr. Wopsle, Joe, and I received strict charge to keep in the rear, and to speak no word after we reached the marshes. When we were all out in the raw air, I treasonably whispered to Joe, "I hope, Joe, we shan't find them." And Joe whispered to me, "I'd give a shilling if they'd cut and run, Pip." A bitter sleet came rattling against us here on the east wind. There I was on Joe's back, and there was Joe beneath me, charging at the ditches like a hunter, and stimulating Mr. Wopsle not to tumble on his Roman nose and to keep up with us. The soldiers were in front of us, extending into a pretty wide line, with an interval between man and man. Under the low red glare of sunset, the beacon and the gibbet and the mound of the battery and the opposite shore of the river were plain, though all of a watery lead colour. With my heart thumping like a blacksmith at Joe's broad shoulder, I looked all about for any sign of the convicts. I could see none. I could hear none. The sheep stopped in their eating and looked timidly at us, and the cattle, their heads turned from the wind and sleet, stared angrily as if they held us responsible for both annoyances. The sheep stopped in their eating and looked timidly at us, and the cattle, their heads turned from the wind and sleet, stared angrily as if they held us responsible for both annoyances. But except these things and the shudder of the dying day in every blade of glass, there was no break in the bleak stillness of the marshes. The soldiers were moving on in the direction of the old battery, when all of a sudden we all stopped, for there had reached us on the wings of the wind and rain a long shout. There seemed to be 2 or more shouts raised together. The sergeant ordered that the sound should not be answered, but that his men should make towards it, at the double. Joe pounded away so wonderfully that I had to hold on tight to keep my seat. As we came nearer to the shouting, it became more and more apparent that it was made by more than one voice. We could hear one voice calling, "Murder!" and another voice, "Convicts! Runaways! Guard! This way for the runaway convicts!" Then both voices would seem to be stifled in a struggle, and then would break out again. "Here are both men," panted the sergeant, struggling at the bottom of a ditch. "Surrender, you two, and confound you for two wild beasts!" Water was splashing, and mud was flying, and oaths were being sworn, and blows were being struck, and when some more men went down into the ditch to help the sergeant, and dragged out separately my convict and the other one. Both were bleeding and panting and struggling. "Mind," said my convict, wiping blood from his face with his ragged sleeves and shaking torn hair from his fingers. "I took him. I gave him up to you. Mind that." "It's not much to be particular about," said the sergeant. "It'll do small good, my man, being in the same plight yourself. Handcuffs there." "I don't expect it to do me any good. I don't want it to do me any more good than it does now," said my convict with a greedy laugh. "I took him. He knows it. That's enough for me." The other convict was livid to look at, and, in addition to the old bruised left side of his face, seemed to be bruised and torn all over. He leaned upon a soldier to keep himself from falling. "Take notice, guard! He tried to murder me." "Tried to murder him?" said my convict disdainfully. "Try and not do it? I took him and give him up. I not only prevented him getting off the marshes, but I dragged him here, dragged him this far on his way back. He's a gentleman, if you please, this villain. Now, the hulks has got its gentleman again, through me." The other one still gasped. "He tried to murder me. Bear witness." "Looky here," said my convict to the sergeant. "Single-handed I got clear of the prison ship. I could have got clear of these death-cold flats. Look at my leg. You won't find much iron on it. If I hadn't made the discovery that he was here. Let him go free. Let him make a fool of me afresh and again. Once more. No, no, no. If I had died at the bottom there," and he made an emphatic swing at the ditch with his manacled hands, "I'd have held to him with that grip that you should have been safe to find him in my hold." The other fugitive, who was evidently in extreme horror of his companion, repeated, "He tried to murder me. I should have been a dead man if you had not come up." "He lies," said my convict with fierce energy. "He's a liar born, and he'll die a liar. Look at his face. Ain't it written there? Let him turn those eyes of his on me. I defy him to do it." The other, with an effort at a scornful smile, looked at the soldiers and looked about at the marshes and at the sky, but certainly did not look at the speaker. "Enough of this parley," said the sergeant. "Light those torches." My convict looked around him for the first time and saw me. I looked at him eagerly when he looked at me, and slightly moved my hands and shook my head. I'd been waiting for him to see me, that I might try to assure him of my innocence. He gave me a look that I did not understand, and it all passed in a moment. But if he had looked at me for an hour or for a day, I could not have remembered his face ever afterwards as having been more attentive. The soldier soon lighted 3 or 4 torches, and took one himself and distributed the others. "All right," said the sergeant. "March!" I had hold of Joe's hand now, and Joe carried one of the torches. Mr. Wopsle had been for going back, but Joe was resolved to see it out, so we went off with the party. After an hour or so of this travelling, we came to a rough wooden hut and a landing place. There was a guard in the hut. The sergeant made some kind of report and some entry in a book, and then the convict, whom I call the other convict, was drafted off with his guard to go on board first. My convict never looked at me, except that once. While we stood in the hut, he stood before the fire looking thoughtfully at it, or putting up his feet by turns upon the hob, and looking thoughtfully at them, as if he pitied them for their recent adventures. Suddenly he turned to the sergeant and remarked, "I wish to say something respecting this escape. It may prevent some persons laying under suspicion along of me. I took some victuals up at the village over yonder, where the church stands, a'most out on the marshes." "You mean stole?" said the sergeant. And I'll tell you where from. From the blacksmith's. It was some broken victuals and a dram of liquor and a pie. Have you happened to miss such an article as a pie, blacksmith? Asked the sergeant. My wife did, at the very moment when you came in, don't you know, Pip? So, said my convict, turning his eye on Joe in a moody manner, and without the least glance at me. So, you're the blacksmith, are you? Then I'm sorry to say I've ate your pie. The something that I had noticed before clicked in the man's throat again, and he turned his back. His guards were ready, so we followed him to the landing place and saw him put into the boat, which was rowed by a crew of convicts like himself. No one seemed surprised to see him, or interested in seeing him, or glad to see him, or sorry to see him, or spoke a word, except that somebody in the boat growled as if to dogs, "Give way, you!" which was the signal for the dip of the oars. By the light of the torches we saw the black hulk lying out a little way from the mud of the shore, like a wicked Noah's ark. Cribbed and barred and moored by massive rusty chains, the prison ship seemed, in my young eyes, to be ironed like the prisoners. We saw the boat go alongside, and we saw him taken up the side and disappear. Then the ends of the torches were flung hissing into the water and went out, as if it were all over with him.